Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is out. That means there are 32 MCU films. So today I'll be ranking all of them from the worst to the best. Also remember, this is just my opinion, so be sure to leave your own list down below, and with that said, let's get started. In last place we have Captain Marvel. This may not be a terrible film or anything, but this is probably one of, if not the most generic and uninteresting film in the franchise. It's a movie I watched when it came out, then never had the desire to rewatch until I did this ranking. A lot of the movie's issues comes down to the lead character herself, which I find to be the weakest of the main characters. She isn't the most likable, and her character arc is basically going from being powerful to being more powerful. Other than that, it's just not a very memorable movie, and I never find myself caring for anything that happens. Also, the scene that explains why Nick Fury lost his eye is the worst scene in the franchise. Up next we have Iron Man 2. Now again, this isn't a terrible film, but I don't think it has much to offer. It can still be fun and entertaining because the characters are still entertaining. Especially having Rhodey join in on the action and become War Machine, and the introduction of Black Widow. But on a story level, it's really forgettable. The villain is easily one of the blandest in the MCU, and for an action film, there are only 2 action scenes in the entire movie. The whole model of the film is just the villain sitting in a lab, and Tony wrecking his home. So not the most entertaining stuff. There were some behind the scenes issues, like the studio giving the movie a deadline way too soon. This meant the production had to be rushed, and you can see that when watching the movie. At number 30 we have Thor: The Dark World. Infamously rated the worst MCU film by most, which is understandable, but I can still enjoy it for quite a few reasons. Firstly, the main standout here is definitely Loki, who really elevated this film and delivers so many twists and turns in a pretty mediocre story. His presence in the film definitely brings it up from being last place. What I also like about the movie is that the main focus is Asgard. My favorite parts of the first Thor film is whenever they focus on Asgard, so it's nice that we get to spend more time there. I feel like this film was made a bit better due to Endgame, as what happens in the film really does matter and ties into the bigger picture. With that said, this film is still not great. The main plot is really boring and uninteresting. A lot of that comes down to the main villain himself, who is so bland. So while it's enjoyable enough, it's one you forget pretty soon after. That brings us to Multiverse of Madness, a movie that is never close to living up to the title, as it hardly feels like it focuses on the multiverse in any interesting way, and kind of as a whole just feels skippable. While there are some cool scenes like the music battle or the cameos, as a whole it didn't really work for me. The film in general feels very unbalanced. For example, there are some great CGI uses and some really awful ones. Where we see Wanda in this film being straight up evil just doesn't feel consistent with where we previously saw her. So there's a big gap there. And in general, I don't think it's a good idea for these films to rely too much on the Disney Plus shows. As if you haven't seen WandaVision, this film would make no sense to you at all. For that reason, it feels a bit inaccessible, but it still had its moments though. That brings us to Eternals, the closest thing to a prestige film in the MCU, and for that reason it doesn't really fit the franchise at all. This movie, while being beautifully produced, made some pretty odd choices. Firstly, it introduces 10 brand new heroes, and tries to give each of them character development and a backstory. In that case, it's just too much to handle in one film. Then for most of the runtime, you hardly ever get these heroes together, as they weirdly keep dropping in and out of the plot at random times. It's just really odd. While this movie does have some really interesting philosophical ideas, it has way too many of them for the runtime. And strangely enough, even though it has a 2.5 hour runtime and is filled with so much, it still had me feeling bored at certain moments. Easily the best thing about the film is the cinematography. It is stunning, and I wish more MCU movies will follow this film's example in that regard. Some of the characters were also really entertaining, and I can't wait to see more of them in the future. That brings us to Thor: Love and Thunder, another pretty low ranking Phase 4 film. In this movie the tone is all over the place, and that is its biggest issue. The film is at its best when focusing on the emotional and serious moments, and when it does it, then it's great. But for most of the runtime, the tone is way too goofy and really just feels like parody. They tried what worked in Ragnarok, then added way too much of it. Like you get some super ridiculous scenes here, like Thor dressed as a hot dog, which just made the character look like a joke. The villain is pretty good at least, and bringing Jane back, with superpowers this time, is also a fun addition. So a pretty unbalanced film, but it's still entertaining. Next up we have The Incredible Hulk. This is a pretty odd film in the MCU, as it really doesn't feel like an MCU film at all, whether it be the more serious tone, or the only film to feature Edward Norton as the Hulk. For these reasons, it's often not very high in most people's lists, but I still find it entertaining. Norton really plays the character well, and the action can be really cool, especially in the end, where just two big monsters punch each other in the face, which is a lot of fun to see. Now there are some problems here. I feel like it meanders a bit in the middle and feels repetitive after a while, but still, way better than most people give it credit. Then we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The second film, while having its moments, was definitely never close to being as good as the first. The humor in this movie can be pretty annoying, and at times it can feel mean-spirited, which definitely doesn't make it the most enjoyable movie to watch. The plot also feels aimless in the middle, but when this movie is great, then it is fantastic. The last 10 minutes or so of the movie is one of the best I rated sequences in the franchise. It gives this film such an emotional ending. The colors and music also add so much life to the movie, so while a lot of it doesn't work for me, there are still some great moments. That brings us to Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. The first film of Phase 5, while having a lot I did like, also felt kind of disappointing. On the positive, it finally introduces the new main villain of the franchise, Kang, who is easily one of the best things about the movie. The visuals and world building surrounding the quantum realm are very cool too, and give off a real Star Wars vibe. I know a lot of people didn't like him, but I really enjoyed MODOK and found him very funny. But the film can feel a bit underwhelming though. It sort of ends exactly where it starts and just feels pretty skippable. Giving it this big scale sort of loses the charms of what these films are normally known for, small light-hearted adventures. Next up we have Thor. This is a pretty good first look into the fantastical side of the MCU, and definitely works best when focusing on Asgard and all the world building surrounding it. It nails the casting, especially with Thor and Loki who are to stand out throughout the franchise. But I do think it loses some of the magic when it goes to Earth, just like Thor does. It is a huge tonal shift, and while it is still entertaining and definitely funnier, I do prefer the Asgard sections of the film. The final battle is also really underwhelming, and Loki doesn't ever feel like a threat until the end of the film, because that's only when Thor finds out he has been tricked this whole time. So certain segments are great, others fall flat. At number 22 we have Ant-Man. Intentionally one of the films with a smaller scale, this heist film is really entertaining. Paul Rudd is cast perfectly as Ant-Man, and all the other side characters bring plenty of charm to the film. Because it handles the character's abilities to shrink, you get some pretty creative action scenes, unlike anything we've seen in the franchise before. Now while it is fun, it doesn't have all that much weight to it though, so automatically it's gonna be a mid-tier MCU film, which isn't a bad thing. I do wish the villain was a bit more interesting, but overall, it's a great watch. That brings us to Ant-Man and the Wasp. Since I've seen this film, I've always liked it a bit more than the original. Again, like the first film, it isn't trying to be the biggest or the best one, it's just trying to be an entertaining movie, and that's what it is. With its light-hearted tone and funny humor, it's easily one of the most rewatchable films in the franchise. Ghost is a much more compelling villain than Darren, and the lead duo is great. It also has a lot of fun playing around with the shrinking technology, which creates some memorable and iconic moments. It definitely does have the smallest scale out of all of these movies and feels very inconsequential, but it's still really entertaining. That brings us to Shang Chi. This film has a lot to love, but just like most of the films in this tier, has a lot of problems too. The best thing about it is easily Wenwu as the villain, one of Marvel's best. Then, because it borrows inspiration from martial arts films, the fighting choreography is really good. I mean, the fights in this film ranges from kung fu on a bus to giant dragon boss fights, all of them being very cool to look at. The world building is also interesting, and while it feels very unique in certain aspects, whenever it tries to do the common MCU tropes, it is at its worst. The overuse of CGI and dumb comedy are some examples. I also find some of the dialogue to be pretty bad, especially in the beginning, but still a fun enough addition. Next up we have Doctor Strange, easily the film on this list with the coolest visuals and style. It sort of uses concepts from Inception, cranks it up to max capacity, and the result is truly magical. It also gives us a great new character in Strange himself, as well as a compelling arc for him. It's also interesting seeing this different side of the MCU mythology, and like I said before, it is visualized in such a cool way. Many criticize it for feeling familiar in its plot, but I think it does enough of its own thing to feel unique and stand out. But unfortunately, it suffers from an issue a lot of these movies do: the villain isn't very interesting. Then we have Black Widow, definitely an odd film when watching these movies in release order, as it dropped in the strangest time possible, after the lead character already died and at the start of a new phase. But looking past that, I think this is a pretty cool spy film in the MCU that introduces some really entertaining new characters like Red Guardian and Yelena. The villain's motive is also terrifying because of how real it feels to an extent. And that is when this movie is at its best, when focusing on the grounded and realistic part of the MCU. The ending of this film is definitely a letdown and feels way too cartoonish when you see people fighting on falling rubble, and Taskmaster is a pretty bland villain, but it's still a good movie. At number 17 we have Iron Man 3, easily one of the most underrated MCU films. I think this movie, while not being as good as the first, is still great. A lot of people hate on this film because of the Mandarin twist, which is understandable but hasn't bothered me all that much. I think Killian is a really solid villain played by a great actor. The action is bigger and better than ever, and you get some really well made scenes like the plane rescue sequence. Another great element in this film is the dialogue and humor. Like in most of the Iron Man films, it's really good. This movie doesn't add a ton to the story as a whole though, but it's still an entertaining watch. Next up we have Avengers Age of Ultron, easily one of the most underrated and overhated films on this list. This movie is kind of tight with the first one for me. What I love about it is it's really the only movie where we get to see the Avengers as a team for the whole runtime. As in the first movie, the team was formed, and in Civil War they broke up again. So in this film you get all the iconic Avengers imagery, like the Twin Jet and Avengers Tower. Ultron is also a really great villain, and you get some nice new members thrown in like Wanda and Vision. There are a few issues here though, like I don't think the humor works all the time, and the Natasha and Bruce subplot isn't the best, but I enjoy this movie every time I see it. And the last thing, parts of it was filmed in my home country, which is always cool to see. That brings us to The Avengers. This film is such a great payoff to Phase 1 and managed to do such a great job of bringing in all these different characters that really set the example of how a big team of movies should be done. The dialogue and interaction between the characters is all top tier, and Loki, like always, is a great villain. Then it all closes up with a big and entertaining final battle that must have been a dream come true for comic fans. I really went back and forth on whether Age of Ultron or this one is better, but I think the dialogue and humor puts this one a spot higher. That brings us to Iron Man. Now this film is such a great introduction to this franchise that feels very small scale now, seen where the MCU has gone in recent years. It is responsible for some of the best casting in the series, as Robert Downey Jr. brings so much charisma and fun to this character. This film is really about Tony's redemptive hero's journey, which is a common plot point but it's executed so well in this film. The action, while not being the biggest and most spectacular, is good action. Even the first flight sequence combined with the great main theme just amps you up when you watch it. The dialogue can also be really good at times, and in general it's just a really fun film to watch. Up next we have Captain America. My favorite of the Phase 1 films is definitely the first Avenger, and probably one of my favorite superhero origin stories. It once again, like most of the films in this era, absolutely nailed the casting. An element that definitely elevates this film is the time period and aesthetic. It's portrayed so well. From the vintage design to the soundtrack, it just creates such a unique vibe for a superhero movie. Because it's set during World War II, it combines elements from superhero films and war films to create a really good mix of both. I do wish the villain was more interesting, as he's played by a great actor. But overall, I don't have too many complaints. I love this film. That brings us to Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. A great follow-up to the first film that really feels like a tribute to Chadwick, but at the same time progresses the story in the most logical next step. There are so many deep emotions and themes in this film, as at its core is grief. With that you get some great Oscar-worthy performances, probably some of the best acting in the franchise. Namor is another great Phase 4 villain, and Shuri is a good pick for being the next Black Panther. The story they decide to go with, making it this geopolitical thriller, is also pretty cool. It adds so much tension throughout the story, so easily one of the best MCU films in recent years. Next up is Guardians of the Galaxy, easily the weirdest group of heroes in this franchise that work so well together. That is really what this movie does so well, is bringing together this group of different characters and making them a top tier movie team. The humor and dialogue is obviously great, and the cast adds so much fun to this film. Each of these characters are given some kind of unique personality trait or backstory that just make them interesting characters. This film also expands the MCU lore by including the space side of the franchise. But most importantly, it sets up the Infinity Stones and Thanos. The actual villain himself is pretty forgettable, but the heroes are so memorable it doesn't really matter at all. Then we have Spider-Man: Homecoming. Definitely the MCU film I've watched the most, as it's just a really enjoyable film to put on. It gives us the MCU's take on a high school movie, and is therefore super relatable. Another reason I love this movie so much, and really all the films in this trilogy, is because Spider-Man is my favorite superhero of all time, and maybe even my favorite character of all time. This movie also gives us an awesome villain in Vulture, who is a nice change in the franchise as he isn't a villain trying to destroy the world. Instead, he's just a guy trying to take care of his family. Tony, even though he's not in the movie a lot, is also a nice addition, being this mentor to Peter. That brings us to Spider-Man Far From Home. Now this film often gets a lot of hate, but I've always loved it. Maybe it's because, as I said before, Spider-Man is my favorite movie character. But I do really find this to be a super entertaining film. What the MCU Spider-Man movies have always nailed are the villains, as here it is no different. Mysterio is a great main villain, played really well by Jake Gyllenhaal, and his first illusion scene is one of the coolest scenes in the entire franchise. The humor is also as great as always, and sure, maybe there are a few plot points that don't make the most sense, but it never took away from my experience with the film. Also, that post-credit scene is insane. Up next we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And don't worry, I won't be giving any spoilers here. The latest MCU movie is definitely one of the best that delivers such a satisfying conclusion to the Guardians trilogy. It really keeps the best elements from the previous films and does it really well, whether it be the humor, emotion, or awesome action scenes. It balances all these elements nicely. The villain here is also very good, easily the best of the trilogy, as he's someone you despise and can't wait to see defeated. And of course, it focuses more on Rocket this time, who's just a great character and deserves his time in the spotlight. Even though he isn't in the movie a ton, Adam Warlock is also a really cool addition. So by the end, it wraps up everyone's story in the best way possible and ends this trilogy on a high note. Then we have Thor Ragnarok, a film I actually didn't like very much when I first saw it, but rewatching it now, I definitely changed my mind. This movie just has so much energy to it, from the bright color palettes to the big action scenes. The characters are more fun and lively than ever, but never feel like parodies of themselves. In Love and Thunder, Thor himself felt goofier than normal, but in this film, even though he's in silly and goofy situations, he still feels like the same character we've seen in the previous films. So Love and Thunder definitely made me change my opinion on this film. And while not all the humor works, this is probably the funniest MCU movie and it's just a blast to watch. Then we have Black Panther, another fantastic MCU film that has some really deep themes and one of the best villains in the whole franchise, portrayed perfectly by Michael B. Jordan. The rest of the cast is also great and there are some really entertaining characters, M'Baku being a standout. The whole world of Wakanda is just brought to life by rich world building, well-designed locations and a great soundtrack. This movie is the perfect example of how to blend serious storytelling with comedy, as even though it has funny moments thrown in, it never feels out of place. Due to its deep themes and laid plot, it is one of the most mature MCU films and is really overall just a beautifully made film that I've always loved since it was released. Up next we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier, a film that I love even more with each rewatch. The plot is incredible, being this political thriller set in the MCU that dials back the humor, giving us a serious film. The story is full of all these twists and turns, as well as some really fantastic, and for the most part, grounded action scenes. It's really memorable action scene after memorable action scene for the whole movie long. Then on an emotional side, it finds a way to bring back Bucky, and make him Steve's rival in this film. The character arc they give Steve is also great, as in the first movie there were very clear heroes and villains, and now we find out he has been working for the villains this whole time. And that results in Steve distrusting the government, which leads to civil war. At number 4 we have Avengers Infinity War, the ultimate team-up movie that tied together all three phases so well and introduced one of the best movie villains of all time. Ignoring the depressing ending, this is a super entertaining movie that has some of the best humor in the franchise. A lot of that comes from all these characters interacting for the first time, which is always fun to see. And having all of these characters team up, you get some awesome action scenes like the Battle of Wakanda or Strange vs Thanos. Then when you come to the ending, it does something that really hasn't been done in the franchise before, or at least to this scale. The heroes lose, which can probably be described as the biggest cliffhanger ever put to screen. Entering the top 3 we have Avengers Endgame, the most satisfying payoff of all time. This movie is the culmination of 10 years of films and it absolutely delivers. The portal scene is one of the best scenes I've ever watched in a movie, and of course when people think of this film, that is the first thing that comes to mind. But the rest of the film is just as great. I love how it's split into 3 different segments, the first focusing on tragedy and loss, the second being a time travel plot, and the third being the payoff. All of these parts work so well together, and honestly there isn't much more to say. This movie is fantastic. In second place we have Captain America: Civil War, or more accurately Avengers 2.5. The film that split the fanbase into 2, Team Cap and Team Iron Man, that started the big debate of who was actually right. This film is so good. It manages to create a scenario that will result in Tony and Steve going against each other, and looking at each of these characters' backgrounds, it made sense. That can be said for everyone in this film, and somehow, with all that going on, it still manages to introduce Spider-Man and Black Panther and never once feels overcrowded. It just feels natural. Then when you get all the Avengers fighting each other at the airport, it's just a superhero fan's dream come true. This is just a perfect Marvel movie that delivers on the action, it delivers on the emotion, and has a great central plot, so easily one of the best MCU films. My coming in at number 1 is Spider-Man No Way Home. I was really debating which film should come in at first place, this or Civil War, and in the end I personally prefer No Way Home. Mainly, as I've said, Spider-Man is my favorite movie character of all time. I also grew up watching the Maguire films, so this movie is a dream come true. It delivers such satisfying fan service, but still feels earned and fits the story they were telling. Apart from all of the fan service and nostalgia, the main plot really ends Peter's trilogy and character arc in the best way possible, and delivers such an emotional climax. What I really love about his trilogy is that all 3 of these films sort of act as his origin story, and here we finally get to see him learn with great power comes great responsibility, and become the Spider-Man we all know. And seeing all the old cast and Spider-Man interact was fantastic. So for these reasons, I think this is the best MCU film.